So, Matt, you write that China is using climate change as a bargaining chip for appeasing behaviour from the West. Why do you think that?
Well, I think China has made it fairly explicit in recent days and weeks, particularly a comment from the foreign minister, where he said that climate change cannot be separated from the larger People's Republic of China-US relations environment. This has become clear in other statements too. There's a very aggressive editorial in one of the Communist Party newspapers about how actually they quite like Britain at the moment, but America really has to moderate its behaviour if it wants a climate agreement, if it wants cooperation on the climate issue. And it just looks to me as if increasingly China thinks about this issue in terms of what it can extract in the way of better behaviour towards China than the issue itself.
Isabel, would you agree with that?
Well, not really. I mean, the Global Times is notorious for aggressive statements about almost everyone. And, next week it might be, the UK is horrible and the United States is our close friend. This changes depending on the agenda of the Global Times or its editor, Hu Shijin. As for Wang Yi, the foreign minister, well, fortunately, Wang Yi doesn't do climate negotiations for China. And in fact, the foreign minister in China is not very high up the pecking order. So again, the foreign ministry is intent on displaying wolf warrior diplomacy and being very assertive in its statements about foreign policy. But the real action is going on elsewhere. So the action is going on partly through the working out of the 14th Five-Year Plan, partly through the State Council, and largely through Xie Jianhua, who is the chief climate negotiator who talks directly with John Kerry. And they've met nearly 20 times already. So there clearly is a lot of action going on, which is shielded. They only talk about climate in that negotiation, and that's the one that counts.
Well, Isabel, what do you think China thinks about tackling climate change? Because we hear so much about China, obviously it's the biggest polluter in the world. We hear a lot about its coal use. Does China care about tackling climate change when we can't even get many other countries around the world, even Britain, to care about tackling climate change all that much?
Well, it depends, who cares and what do you think they care about? Certainly, climate change has been very high up the political agenda in China since China became the world's biggest emitter, which was in 2005. And since then, a policy on climate change has been elaborated, which has partly been about a domestic transition, which we would all love to see go faster, and there's a lot of frustration around that. But it's also about industrial strategy. So China identified very early on that the technologies of the future would likely be low-carbon technologies and built an industrial strategy around having a strong position in those. And that gave China a direct interest in a carbon-constrained world because it hopes to supply the market and does supply the market for a carbon-constrained world. And that also fed into China's own mitigation strategies, which, as I say, really need to go faster. But nevertheless, China has the largest, by far, installed capacity of renewables. And one of China's problems was that it had gone so far down its route of dependence on coal that it takes a lot to turn that tank around. But if you look at all the indicators that China has been measuring its behaviour against for the past decade, things like energy density, how much energy you consume to produce a dollar of GDP and so on, and indeed coal use and coal dependency in primary energy, all of those are moving in the right direction. They're just not going fast enough.
Matt, what do you make of this idea of we've got of China being polluter, but at the same time it's moving into the renewables industry in terms of technology? Could renewable technology be, the next telecoms where China has, stolen a march and we hadn't quite even realised its market leadership, and maybe in the future the West will rely on Chinese renewable tech because we've got this idea of China being a polluting power rather than a green power?
Well, China certainly supplies an enormous proportion of the world's renewable technologies, particularly with respect to some of the ingredients of those technologies, the rare earths and other minerals that need to go into the batteries and magnets in wind turbines, the solar panels and so on. China sees it as an enormous opportunity. And if we are rushing headlong into trying to become reliant on unreliable renewables, in the West, as we are, then that is a fantastic opportunity for China to sell us stuff. And sadly, most of what we're installing in the way of wind and solar in the West is indeed supplied by China. And at the same time, the reason China is able to do that is because actually you need a lot of coal to make this stuff. You need coal to fuel, to make wind turbines, for example, and you need a lot of oil to fuel the vehicles that do the mining and so on. And, the quantity of coal that China is consuming is truly gigantic. It's about 1,000 gigawatts of coal-fired capacity at the moment, and adding another 100 in the pipeline. Well, Britain has less than 100 total generating capacity of all kinds.
Although China is many more times bigger than the UK with a much larger population as well.
Indeed, and it's getting worse. They're
but I mean, per capita, would it be less gigawatts per person probably?
They're using coal to make oil at the moment, which is a extremely carbon-intensive process, and they're not even going to peak their coal use, their emissions, until 2030, and not going to head for net zero until after 2060. So they're pretty empty promises coming out of China on the environmental thing, and yet they get a very easy ride from Western environmentalists. You never hear them criticising the Chinese regime. They're very critical of Western governments, and I don't fully understand why that is.
Well, Isabel?
Well, I'm not sure who Matt talks to, but I talk to a lot of environmentalists, and I hear criticisms all the time. And if you go online and look what's being said by Western environmentalists about, for example, China's coal use, there is no praise at all for China. There's praise for China where China deserves praise, as there would be for any other country. I mean, one of the difficulties about talking rationally about China is the fact that China is so big. And as we all know, there are many ways to measure emissions. There are historic emissions, per capita emissions, and so on. And in per capita terms, China's about 7 tons per head per year now. The United States is at 18. So, again, if you're looking at the degree of effort, you can make a case for China. But I don't think that this particular finger pointing is very helpful. We all need to do more on climate change. Certainly Britain has the leakiest and most inefficient housing stock in all of Europe, and we still don't have a plan to address that. So I think the best way to approach things like COP26 is to look to our own house and put it in order and encourage others to do the same. And China is certainly not the worst in this respect. It's the biggest, but in policy terms, it's not the worst.
Well, Matt, let me bring you in on this one, because I know from your writings and your book that you believe in economic growth, and that you believe with greater economic growth, some of these environmental problems can then be tackled, using technology to tackle climate change rather than, maybe obsceneness or hair shirts and that sort of stuff. If China is still behind America in terms of per capita pollution, isn't that because China is still behind America in terms of per capita GDP? i.e. the Chinese people are still transitioning to a much more middle-class developed living standard. So should they be given a slightly different understanding on their pollution in the same way that, for example, the West went through the Industrial Revolution?
Well, what happens when a country industrializes is that at first it uses more energy and then gradually becomes more efficient. Isabel made this point earlier. And we've seen enormous improvements in the West in the amount of emissions you need to produce $1 of GDP or £1 of GDP. And that's because of innovation. It's because of new technologies that enable us to use fossil fuels more efficiently, to switch to lower carbon fossil fuels like natural gas rather than coal, and to use other technologies like nuclear. I'm not at all convinced that renewables are in any way relevant to that transition, because an awful lot of fossil fuels is used in producing them. They're very low energy efficiency in terms of energy return on energy invested. They're extremely unreliable, so you have to have backups to them. If we want to solve this problem, if we want to have a functioning, modern, industrial, wealthy society without producing any carbon emissions, then we're either going to have to tackle burying carbon in the ground through a carbon capture and storage industry, or we're going to have to get very serious about nuclear fission and fusion in the longer term. I personally think it's the most of the rest is simply a waste of time and playing into the hands of those who really don't care about the environment. They just care about making money, and frankly, filling the North Sea with industrial structures while doing an enormous amount of very dirty mining in China for the materials doesn't feel to me like an environmentally beneficial thing to be doing.
Well, but do you think that China's coal-fueled economic growth is something that is, understandable or rather justifiable?
Well, clearly, coal is an extremely efficient source of energy. There's no question about that. I come from the northeast of England, where coal mining is built the prosperity of this country. There's no question about that. But the degree to which China is prepared to expand that industry and use it in pretty inefficient ways doesn't seem to me something we should simply ignore and excuse.
I don't think anyone is ignoring or excusing China's coal use, to be fair. There are questions around energy security which are being exacerbated by geostrategic tensions, which may explain part of China's continuing expansion of its domestic coal. But, China has promised to peak its emissions, and that will involve closing down a great deal of its coal capacity. It's promised to peak its emissions by 2030 or before, actually, and certainly its net zero target is 2060, not 2060 or after, as Matt said. There are other ways that countries change their energy profile beyond innovation, and one of them is by changing their industrial base, and China has gone through that very heavily emitting, construction of infrastructure, all that heavy industrial development, which countries tend to go through in the rapid sort of catch-up phase. And then they transition to higher value technologies. They stop doing so much, heavy, dirty stuff. They built all their infrastructure. So their emissions tend to level off because they're engaged in economic activities that demand less primary energy input. The other thing that we did, of course, was we outsourced our emissions in a very large degree to China by outsourcing manufacturing to a low-wage economy in China, and almost all Western countries did this, which impacted their own emissions profile, but of course did make China's go the other way. So this is an endless, complicated argument if you want to go the route of, telling a simple story about emissions. It doesn't really work. And as I said, I think the best way to tackle this problem is for each country to try its best to put its own house in order. And China, for all the frustrations that we all have with China's emissions, and particularly its coal sector, it's a great deal better than it was 10 years ago. And as long as it goes on moving in the right direction, I think we should encourage it to move faster rather than criticise it for everything it does.
Matt, would you like to come back on that?
Well, I just don't think this conversation is happening in a vacuum. The point is, this is happening at a time when there are huge human rights problems in China, a terrible suppression of liberty, appalling things happening to the Uyghur peoples, the crushing of Hong Kong, and a terrible pandemic that originated in China, and the investigation into the origin of which we are simply not being given a transparent opportunity to pursue. And it feels as if quite a lot of politicians in the West are pulling their punches on some of those issues because they want Chinese cooperation on climate. And that seems to me it should be brought to the attention of the public.
I'm not sure that there's any evidence for that. Often politicians pull their punches on China, I agree, and I don't dissent from anything that Matt has said about the human rights abuses and so on. But they tend to pull their punches for economic reasons, because they hope to do business. And, we saw that particularly with the Cameron government, which I think Matt was fairly closely acquainted with, which, adopted a policy of complete appeasement and abasement to China and was lavishly praised, amongst others, by the Global Times for doing so, and essentially told, yes, that's how we want foreigners to behave. I don't think it did anybody very much good, to be honest. But what I find most puzzling about this argument is I'm not quite sure how not cooperating on China improves not cooperating on climate improves human rights in China, or indeed improves any of the other ills that we wish to address. It makes no difference.
Well, I think it's more a question of whether or not, in our pursuit of climate, we are letting that climate agreements. We are letting that get in the way of other interests, and I think that does happen. And I think the degree to which the Conference of the Parties in Glasgow has, partly because it's been delayed for a year, intruded on almost every diplomatic conversation over the last year or two is problematic. We know that the Glasgow conference is not going to achieve very much. We know that because it's the 26th such meeting, and the previous 25 haven't solved the problem, and they've come up with some extraordinary sleights of hands to sort of pretend they're solving the problem. I mean, the Paris Agreement basically came up with it insisted it was going to come up with a binding treaty. In fact, it came up with a binding treaty to have non-binding promises, which is a sort of sleight of hand. And the Cancun Agreement came up with an agreement to create, but not to fund, a fund of climate. We're going to have some similar sort of compromise out of Glasgow. Is it really worth it to have these tens of thousands of people descending upon Britain to have this rather meaningless conversation? And at the same time, I do think we pull our punches on China because of it. And yes, I do think that we need to be calling much more openly, for example, for a proper investigation into the origin of the virus. When Australia did that, they simply had trade sanctions slapped on them. That just doesn't feel like a very sensible way for a global power to behave.
Well, I'm very happy to criticise China for that. I just don't think it's related to the question of climate. Australia wasn't complaining about China's climate policy, and Australia actually is pretty much a laggard in climate negotiations. It's one of the countries with a very, very high per capita emissions. So I'm not quite sure the relevance of that episode to COP26. And the idea that the conferences and the whole UNFCCC process hasn't achieved anything is frankly extremely questionable. I mean, look at the counterfactual. Where would we be without it? Our emissions would be much higher. We would not be innovating. We would not be attempting an energy transition without this whole process. It's a very long and complicated business to upend the world's energy sources, and the great many people, of course, have vested interests in the existing energy sources and the traditional high-emitting carbon sectors, and they obfuscate and they resist and they cause a great deal of difficulty to those who are trying to find a way through. But that doesn't mean that no progress is made. I mean, we have made enormous progress, both in our scientific understanding of the human impacts on climate and in the many ways that we can tackle it. And many countries have reduced their carbon footprint dramatically. The European Union has a really remarkable project, the European Green Deal. countries are coming up with transition plans as a result of the Paris Agreement. None of that would have happened without UNFCCC and the conference.
Would have happened. The major reduction in the emissions intensity in the United States was due to the discovery of shale gas and the cheap gas replacing coal as a source of fuel. That's the big impact that's come on emissions in there.
And the per capita emissions of the United States are still twice as high as China. So it's not really an example.
You said that the emissions reduction had come as a result of the treaties. I don't think that's the case. The emissions reduction has come as a result of changes in technology within the fossil fuel industry.
And other reductions have come as a result of policies adopted because of the UNFCCC process and the discussions around climate change and the reiteration of the scientific evidence of anthropogenic climate change. All of this has been contested at every point, but nevertheless it has managed to advance. And I find it really quite surprising that you should argue that it would have happened regardless, given the degree of resistance that there has been by any number of sectors and interests that wish not to see us change.
Well, let's continue talking about climate change and tackling climate change and COP26 closer to COP26, but we're running out of time. So Matt, I just want to finish on one final question to you, which is that you mentioned all of these human rights abuses that are happening in China, all of the ways it's behaving in ways that the West doesn't like. Going forward, what do you think is the West's relationship with China on climate change? What do you think that should be if these other things don't change? So what I'm asking is cooperation justifiable? Should it happen if China doesn't stop oppressing the Uyghur people, if China doesn't stop oppressing the Hong Kong people, if China doesn't stop doing these other things? Should we just not cooperate with China on climate change?
No, I think, of course, we have to cooperate and on climate change and on everything else. We live in the same planet, and we have to try and find a way of living with people. But I think that the process of these vast meetings and the lead up to them and the desire to extract concessions has led us to sometimes be somewhat inadequate in the way we talk about other issues. And I therefore think that it would be much better to get away from these vast annual meetings with, I'm sorry to say, futile outputs, because they are futile, seen from outside by ordinary people. These are talking shops that produce pieces of paper. These aren't where the action happens. And, the improvements have come from technology, not from policy. 90% of them, I would say.